You know, I've reached a sort of crossroads in my life, and I've been lately trying to retrace the events of my past in order to understand, among other things, why my case of seasonal depression has lasted the last 7 years. And to be honest, I've been having trouble pinpointing the place where it all went wrong. However, I may have stumbled upon an explanation for the horrific trauma I have been subjected to since adolescence, and it all has to do with perhaps the most vile, manipulative, and gratuitous corporation that has ever plagued our planet. Disney Channel original movies, or DCOMs for short, were originally produced television films by the Disney Channel, and I fucking lived for this shit. From Leprechauns to 9/11 to Jewish teens excelling at sport, no subject was too out there for a DCOM. The golden age of DCOMs, I would argue, is from around 1996 to the mid-2000s, ending with the release of High School Musical, and thus the Disney Corporation's realization that they could milk the ever-loving shit out of pretty much anything at the expense of their primary audience of preteens whose parents gave them way too much allowance and not nearly enough adult supervision, myself being a prime example. Anyway, these films were my lifeblood. They aired pretty much every night at around 8, and seeing as they only made on average like 8 of these a year, suffice to say I have seen a good chunk of them more times than my mother told me that screenwriting was a waste of a college degree. So suffice to say I am verbatim in this shit. And seeing as how many fond recollections I possessed of these fantastic films, I figured they would be the perfect antidote for my existential dread. Unfortunately, upon rewatching them, I came to the sullen realization that these films were absolutely batshit insane. The plots, the themes, the messages were just so crazy. It's no wonder that when I was 13, my dad's ex-fiancée wrote a formal letter of concern to my mother in which she insinuated that I was autistic. How could I have possibly had a normal childhood when I was being pumped full of on-the-nose preaching and being instilled with an incredible amount of FOMO, knowing that I would never have a mummy best friend, or live in a bitchin' space station, or be able to join my school's Latina dance troupe? Yeah, si se puede my nuts. Now, I'm not saying that these films were inherently designed to be blatant propaganda, although there was plenty of that. I'm simply saying that seeing as these films had a primary audience made up of ADHD babies such as myself, they were designed with the intent to be stimulating and not narratively compelling or sensical. And thus, the writers didn't put a whole lot of care and thought into things like world building or boundary setting. And therefore, it is absolutely astounding to look back on these films and see the numerous and in some cases absolutely existentially terrifying implications that these gaps in consistency result in, as well as the fact that more often than not, these films teach kids horrible life lessons. And in an effort to help some of you other DCOM-induced trauma-ridden bastards cope with your affliction, we are going to tackle these devilish creations head-on and dispel the power they possess. And given the time of year, I figured it would be fitting to begin this series with one of the most memorable of all the DCOMs. Halloweentown was released in 1998 and tells the story of the Piper children, Marnie, Dylan, and stupid fucking Sophie, and their mother Gwen, played by Judith Hoag. Okay, I'm going to take a quick aside right here, seeing as Judith Hoag played a significant role in my preteen sexual awakening. I used to spend a lot of time over my Grammy's house, and when she wasn't watching MMA cage fighting because she didn't know how to change the station, me and my little sister and cousins would gather around in front of her 32-inch, built like a nuclear missile silo Magnavox television and enjoy a nice VHS tape. Now, my Grammy only had 3 movies on VHS: the 1990 film adaptation of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Fried Green Tomatoes, and Christmas Around the World with Perry Como. Now, I love me some Perry Como, but I was overruled most of the time by my older cousins. Fried Green Tomatoes is quite the emotionally draining experience, so that one we relegated to bi-monthly viewings. So we ended up more often than not watching TMNT. Now, this movie kicked fucking ass. We got a badass Shredder and Splinter, Sam Rockwell in his second role ever, Elias fucking Koteas as Casey fucking Jones, but the highlight of the film was of course Judith Hoag as April O'Neil, and to this day stands as the best April O'Neil, and I highly doubt she will ever be surpassed. I also blame this film for making me a thigh guy, though I'm not exactly complaining. Anyway, Gwen doesn't want her children trick-or-treating for some mysterious reason. We aren't let in on as to why until later in the movie, so we go into the first 15 thinking Gwen's some secret Calvinist Puritan who doesn't want her sin-free daughters to be corrupted by Halloween get-togethers in fucking Oregon. Marnie is totally not chill with her mother's iron fist ruling.
Oh no, Marnie. It's too dangerous. There are things about vegetables that you don't understand.
It's funny that the most unrealistic thing in a film full of wizards and alternate dimensions is the fact that Marnie, being a middle-class suburban kid who grew up in the 90s in a single-parent household, was able to give her mother this much lip without getting an open-hand slap straight across her face. But then, the kid's grandmother Aggie Cromwell, played by the late great Debbie Reynolds, arrives. Now, based on her attire, we first assume Aggie is just some hippy-dippy grandma who probably baked just a smooch of THC into the cookies she gives to her grandkids, which would explain the disdain in which her Puritan-ass daughter Gwen addresses her with. Anyway, it's revealed that Aggie is in fact a witch, and so are the rest of the Cromwell clan. Aggie claims she must begin Marnie's training tonight or Marnie's witch powers will disappear forever, which is something Gwen is hoping for. And here we set up the quote-unquote life lesson that the film aims to teach its audience. How Gwen must put aside her feelings and allow Marnie to be what she truly is and live her life as the witch she was born to be. Yeah, we'll come back to this. Anyway, after sneaking downstairs and overhearing this private conversation between Aggie and Gwen, which doesn't seem so private since they're screaming at each other in the middle of the night, Marnie and Pencil Neck Dylan and later Stupid Sophie trail Aggie and follow her back to her home of Halloweentown. Aggie explains to her dumbass grandkids that the monsters and creatures of Halloweentown used to live together with the mortals in peace, until the mortals tried to destroy Aggie and her freaky friends, and so they apparently made their own world in a different dimension, cause that's apparently something they can just fucking do. Gwen ends up realizing her kids are missing and travels to Halloweentown to bring them back. But she gets sidetracked when she runs into the mayor of the town, Calabar, aka Spooky Justin Trudeau, who it is alluded to Gwen had carnal relations with before she took her puritanical vows. While this is going on, shit is going down in Halloweentown. Many residents are all of a sudden becoming extremely ugly and aggressive, and then they disappear altogether. They end up finding out that this dude is the cause of it, as well as the cause of many a night terror for 7-year-old me. Aggie tries to stop him, but both her and Gwen are put on freeze frame, leaving the kids to try and rescue them by themselves, by way of creating a magical potion and using it to power up Merlin's talisman, because that's also a thing that exists in this universe apparently. They assemble the ingredients for said potion by committing low-level acts of xenophobic mocking, dental malpractice, and straight-up assault on unsuspecting members of the community, and then confront the big baddie in the town square who reveals himself to be Calabar, who plans to lead a, I assume, violent uprising against the mortal world. The kids break the spell on their mother and grandma, and then together as a loving family use their heathen powers to straight-up murder Calabar's ass, which the townsfolk react to with a roaring applause. Keep in mind that at this point in the narrative, the townsfolk don't really know any of the bad shit Calabar has done. The only thing he is guilty of at this point is enticing them to lead a revolution against their human oppressors, a crime for which the penalty is apparently death by disintegration. The film ends with Gwen realizing the error of her ways and inviting Aggie to come live with them so she can train Marnie in the powers of the Wiccan. Once again, a film of magic and warlocks, and one of the most unrealistic scenes is a middle-aged woman asking her mother to move in with her indefinitely. Okay, lots of issues here, but before we get into them, let's discuss the horrifying reality that is Halloweentown. Aggie describes Halloweentown as a place where the creatures and monsters of the world sought refuge following being cast out by the mortals. So it's a self-imposed internment camp. You can spin it any way you want, but that's the most comparable example I can think of, with the citizens of Halloweentown being hunted and pursued to such an extent by mortals that they had to flee to another fucking dimension to be rid of said torment. I also like how Aggie low-key slips over the likely fucked up shit that the mortals did to the Halloweenies that forced them to fuck off to another dimension. Hey grandma, I wanted to ask you about this thing I learned in history class, something about trials that took place in eastern Massachusetts like a few hundred years ago. Yeah, we don't talk about that, Marnie. We don't really bring that up around here, okay? Look, I'm no expert on Halloweentown lore, but based on this implication in the writing, it kind of makes evil-ass Calabar, like, kind of right. He's basically the Malcolm X of this universe, who wants to lead a revolution against their oppressors. And if you think that word is too extreme in this situation, keep in mind that to a person from Halloweentown, Halloween in the mortal world consists of them basically partaking in the monster equivalent of blackface, in addition to the fact that mortals have been making celluloid framing these people as vicious killing machines for nearly a century. This implication also puts the entire lesson of the film in a ridiculously hypocritical light. The movie sets it up as if Gwen is the bad guy for wanting her children to grow up as non-magical individuals, who comes to her senses by the end of the film. But like, Gwen has totally valid reasons for this. Come on Gwen, lighten up. Why wouldn't you want your children to grow up with magical powers? Powers that would most likely lead to them being labeled as horrifying beasts by basically everyone they know, and result in them being kidnapped by federal law enforcement, who would no doubt conduct experiments on them, or sleep deprive them until they were delusional enough to reveal the location of Halloweentown so Uncle Sam can bomb the ever-loving fuck out of it. And that is if the government even got their hands on them before the local townspeople tossed Marnie's ass into Detroit Lake to see what the hell would happen. And there's also the fact that Aggie most likely wants Marnie to come and live with her in Halloweentown to begin her training. The only problem is...
Don't panic, dear. You see, time works differently in Halloweentown. 2 hours there might be 2 days here, or 2 weeks if we're on vacation.
So they throw out this ridiculously unclear and inconsistent time difference bullshit, which is literally only used in the movie to circumvent the very small plot point of them not being able to travel back to the mortal world within a set time frame, something they just say fuck it to in the sequel, but I digress. But it opens the door to unlimited implications of existential terror. So obviously Aggie doesn't age the same way she would in the mortal world, right? So let's say she visits Gwen and her kids every year on Halloween. Aggie states that
2 hours there might be 2 days here, or 2 weeks if we're on vacation.
So let's say 1 hour equals 1 day. So that's 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, which comes out to 8,640 hours, which is the equivalent of 8,640 days, aka about 23 and a half years in Halloweentown. And seeing as Aggie doesn't look like one of those wrinkly ass monstrosities from Cocoon, the implication is that Halloweentown has some sort of effect on Aggie that slows down the biological deterioration of her being. So if Marnie were to go to Halloweentown for let's say 2 years in mortal world time, it would feel like over 4.5 decades to her, and as we have established, Marnie would not age biologically, but she would mentally, right? Like she spent 45 fucking years living and learning and studying decades of history and gaining so much life experience, and then goes back to the mortal world just in time for her 8th grade graduation. Also, they don't establish any sort of method of communication between the worlds until the sequel. So Marnie is just going to be completely cut off from her mother and siblings for what's going to feel like a quarter of her mortal lifespan? What if something horrible happens and Marnie is unable to get back to the mortal world? What if stupid Sophie eats one too many paint chips and bites it? Marnie frolics off the Halloweentown bus to her sorrowful and alcoholic mother, waiting for her, and has to learn the bad news like that? Anyway, thank you for reminiscing with me this fine evening, and I hope we are one step closer to dispelling the numerous and sadistic DCOM demons that find refuge within our fractured minds. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, consider supporting me on Patreon, and join me next episode of DCOM Retrospect, where we discuss the avant-garde classic, The 13th Year, where we will discuss all the traumatizing effects that turning into a fucking mermaid can have on you, as well as addressing the fact that our main character was probably never vaccinated, but that's a story for a different time. Thanks for tuning in, I'll see you next time.